Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris van der Walt. I work at United Nations Global Pulse. We're here this afternoon to discuss a new piece of tech that we're building at the United Nations. My colleagues here are Dane Petersen from Adaptive Path and Sara, who's our Chief Platform Architect at Global Pulse. So before we get into the tech bit, I'd like to explain a little bit of the context of what we're building and why. United Nations Global Pulse is a project that is based at the United Nations in the Office of the Secretary General. It's about 2 years old. Our mission is to harness innovation to protect the vulnerable. And I know that's kind of a squishy definition of vulnerability. So this is a sort of a working definition. There's a lot of dispute over what vulnerability actually is. But essentially what we're talking about are the poor and the marginalized, those who have minimal options to adapt and cope in response to impacts. And to give you a sense of the scope of the problem, right now there are over 1 billion people in extreme poverty in the world. And according to our definition, we're not just focused on those already in poverty, we're also focusing on those at risk of falling into poverty. So we're actually talking about billions of people. And given the current state of the world and the financial instability that we're witnessing, the strange weather we're starting to see, we're concerned that the cascading effects of systemic risk and crises are going to push even more people into poverty, destroy lives and livelihoods. And in trying to understand this problem of how the international community and governments and NGOs can understand the problem and make policy recommendations and interventions to actually create social safety nets to mitigate these kinds of effects, we're faced with a really big problem. Right now, when we only get information about the vulnerable 2 to 5 years after the event, which is great if you want to write a historical paper about what happened to people, but it's no good if you're actually trying to design real-time interventions and save lives. So you can hear this is information from the latest Millennium Development Goals report, and you can see that most of the information we're actually still trying to understand what happened in 2008, 2009, never mind what's actually going on right now. So we have a non-trivial problem to solve. And when we sort of got together and had a little bit of a panic about how we were actually going to try and solve this problem, we started looking around for what the opportunity spaces were, what the emerging technologies and emerging relationships that we can foster in order to try and solve some of these problems. So we noticed, first of all, that there's a proliferation of sensors out there. Sensors are being embedded in everything from mobile phones to cars to buildings to vehicles. They're part of industrial processes. They're part of our global supply chains. We think we can derive a lot of information value from those. They're also big data, obviously. This is what the conference is about, and I'm sure you've heard all about big data. Right now, big data is being used to drive better business decisions, but it's not being used to help development. So we want to bring the kind of agility that's now being witnessed in the business space into the development space. One of the other pursuits that we're trying to investigate right now is how we can use the passive data exhaust of people's interactions with digital services to look for the signatures of distress so that we can intervene sooner. And we'll be building that into HunchWorks, but we're doing a whole bunch of research projects just to see if those collective behavior changes in response to impacts and to crisis can be identified in real time so that we can actually make recommendations and investigate further to solve these kinds of problems. We also recognize the massive value of social and collaborative technologies. So you can now have distributed teams collectively solving problems on a global scale. This is an opportunity we think for an organization like the United Nations offers massive possibilities. And also assistive reasoning. So the ability to combine human expertise, big data, discovery, mining, and analytics, we think offers us one of the few opportunities to operate at this kind of to derive intelligence at this kind of scale quickly. And so we're very keen to adapt and build assistive reasoning into our systems. And finally, people. So because there are 5 billion mobile phones in the world, we can actually start thinking of a kind of a global neural network of interconnected human beings who can tell us what they need, or either directly or indirectly. And in terms of responding, we can coordinate. The coordination costs are much lower. So one of the things that we've recognized for organizations like the United Nations, we have a lot of people on the ground in all of the areas that we're most interested in. But right now, what we have is a dumb network. So the transactional costs of communication within these organizations mean that it's very hard to gather the collective understanding or the situational awareness of our staff and communicate it in a meaningful way into the organization. There's also massive waste in terms of cross-institutional knowledge sharing and resource sharing. So what we want to do is we want to create a tool that allows the sensory periphery of the organization, which has the most contextually relevant and knowledge, to be able to communicate that both amongst themselves at the periphery and into the core, into the decision-making core of the organizations, and to allow that information to diffuse into the space to have a beneficial knowledge effect within the entire international development space. So when we're thinking about how you can understand and identify the early signals of crisis impacts on populations, we're very interested in this idea of weak signals. So this is a term that's come out of studies in futurism. And essentially, there's a recognition that when there are trends that culminate in very destructive and disruptive events, there are often early indicators, early trends, early signals. But too often they're trapped in a very noisy informational environment. And what happens is, by the time the signal gets strong enough for you to respond, you have a very small window to respond. And in the case of a big international organization like ours, the wheels turn slowly. So if we can detect the signal earlier, but while it's still a weak signal, we have more time to intervene, to set those wheels in motion. We also have a much better chance of dampening the consequences. So we can actually dampen the signal, we can dampen the effects. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a tool that does all those things, a non-trivial problem. And we're calling the tool HunchWorks. HunchWorks is a hypothesis management system to detect weak signals. We aim to combine both human and computational intelligent agents together in a system to use the situational awareness that we have on the ground, to use the big data environment, to use the sensory environment that we're starting to see grow even in developing countries, and to engage the human capacity of the international community to act as a detector system for crises. So the way the Hunch mechanism works is if a person on the ground or a researcher detects what they consider to be a potentially meaningful signal, they can propose a hunch about it or hypothesize about it. They can share their hunch within their trusted networks. The network then acts to give feedback on the hunch, whether that be in terms of evaluating the hunch itself, the premise, or contributing new evidence to the space, voting on existing evidence, and voting on the value and the reputation of the other users of the space. Once the hypothesis evolves by consensus to a point where we think it's actionable, we're also building tools to enable action, to enable further communications to develop or to intervene more effectively. So I'll give you a use case of how we envisage the system working. In this use case, we're going to take the example of a staff member in one of our labs, innovation labs that we're planning and building in a number of countries around the world. She notices an increase in population movements from Kenya and suspects that it's because the drought in the Horn of Africa is forcing people out of certain regions, and she wants to determine whether that may or may not be true. So initially, she proposes a hunch. She describes the hunch. She then is able to add evidence to the hunch. And because weak signals The evidentiary process there is likely to be more informal. It's very hard early on in detecting weak signals to have very hard evidence, so we recognize that. So the evidence can be observational, it can be anecdotal, it can be tweets, it can be photographs, it can be videos, it can be data sets if they're available. She tags it. She brings any locational data. And then she has the option to share it. Sorry, as she's going through, the system will start to surface hunches that are similar to hers. We want to reduce redundancy in the system. So if there are existing hunches that are along the same lines as hers, it may be better for her to join in that discussion rather than start a new discussion. So the system will surface hunches based on keywords, based on description, and based on location. And then it's very important in terms of the context of the work that we're doing that there's control over how public the hunch is. We want to encourage open sharing as much as possible because then we get to derive the most network effects from the hunch. But we recognize also that intra-organizational hunches, they may want to keep their hunches to themselves until they feel that they're actionable or they're worthy of sharing. So we have three models. We have an open model, we have a closed model where some of the metadata about a hunch will be made available to other users so that they can discover maybe the title and maybe some keywords about the hunch, but they can't see any of the data and they can't see any of the interactions unless they request to be allowed in. And then because the UN works in some very hostile environments, either politically or politically charged environments where the lives of staff might be at risk or where data is extremely sensitive, we're also building a hunch type which is completely closed, it's invisible to the system, and it's by invitation only. Once she's done that, she can determine who she wants to share it with, either with groups or with individual contacts. And once she publishes the hunch, HunchWorks will start to surface related hunches and with confidence metrics as determined by the community. Once she shares it, she starts to get feedback from other members of her community on stories that are starting to emerge. It may also be data sets. And so you have a process where the hunch actually acts as an attractor for evidence. Not only in that relevant information is surfaced, but also it means that you're telling your networks what to look for. So it has a very active effect on your network. It activates your network to go out and look for certain kinds of signals. So the metrics, we in terms of building trust in the system and being able to track the value of contributions and the value of the conversation, therefore, you need to be able to see who's contributing what and what the level of interaction and the discussion is around a hunch. We also recognize that it's not good enough to have an up or down voting mechanism. It's almost as important, or maybe even more important, to know why someone thinks a piece of evidence is valuable or why a hypothesis is valuable as it is just to know whether they think it's good or bad. Being able to understand who's part of the conversation, their expertise in the space, what relevant skills they have, is also an important way of determining the value of the conversation. And once there's a consensus view that the hunch is actionable, that the weak signal is actually a good predictor of downstream effects, the hunch can be resolved, either closed out. If the discussion lies fallow, you can just say, well, we're going to leave this as a fallow conversation, and then take action from that point forward. So when we started this project, we recognized the value of the human component in building a tool like this. If we can't build out the network effects into the system, if we don't get a good user base, if they don't trust the tool, if they don't see the value in their work, it's not going to work. So we reached out to Adaptive Path, a user design company based in San Francisco, Austin, and Amsterdam. And they very kindly donated a team to help us develop the user experience design for what is a very complex problem to solve. And I'm very happy to introduce Dane Petersen, who's going to walk through some of the user experience design. Sorry.
Thank you, Chris. So traditionally, as we're Traditionally, as we're kind of thinking about the design of a computer system, we think that we're mostly concerned with kind of what's going on the screen. You know, what the interface looks like, what the icons look like, kind of how the windows are arranged, how one screen kind of gives away to another. And this kind of makes sense because it feels like as we work 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, if we're lucky, it feels like we spend most of our time like looking at this box in front of us. And so I work for Adaptive Path, and we are an experience design consultancy. And we've been doing user experience design for over a decade now. And so we don't necessarily take the interface as our starting point. We're actually more kind of concerned about people and kind of what's going on inside of their heads. Like, how do they sort of in their brains like slice up the world? Like, what are they thinking about? Kind of what makes the most sense as far as how different things are sort of sliced and diced. And so we're concerned about how people think and their cognition and everything, and sort of how they process the world. But we're also really concerned about people's hearts, and kind of what's meaningful to them, and what motivates them, what gets them out of bed in the morning. We're concerned about kind of what's meaningful and what's valuable, like the human connections they have. Because the belief is that if we can tap into what actually motivates people, what they find truly meaningful, we can build better products, we can build better services, and we can build better things that people are actually going to want to use and enjoy using. And so if you had to twist our arm and like tell us like what our design process might look like, if we drew it out on paper, it might look something like this. We usually start out our projects with doing research. We go out and we talk to people. We kind of learn how they lead their lives, and usually kind of within the context of whatever product we're designing. From there, we'll move on to insights that we get from our research, sort of like coalescing everything and sort of bringing it together to try to figure out like what the most important thing to focus on is. And so with HunchWorks, we got together near the beginning of this project, and we made huge messes with sticky notes and everything to try to prioritize what the most important things for us to focus on with this project were. And so after we sort of do this research synthesis and sort of combine and figure out what our insights are, we move on into concepting. And when we generate concepts, we tend to generate a lot of concepts, like anywhere from 200 to 400 ideas. And that might sound kind of burdensome, but a lot of the ideas are just really sort of at a really rough sketch level. Again, we're just trying to explore the entire universe of like what this particular product or service, or in the case of HunchWorks, like this global system, like what should this look like? And then as we sort of progress through these concepts, they end up getting a little bit richer and richer and a little more fleshed out. And from there, we can move into a wireframing thing, where now we're finally starting to think about like what the screens look like. And again, these wireframes can be pretty rough. We're just sort of working more digitally now and trying to figure out how different steps in a process fit together. But then again, just as with the sketches, like these wireframes start to get a little bit more sophisticated. And then finally, once we've got these wireframes, like once we've done all this work and we can sort of try to figure out like how this thing should all sort of fit together, we can move on and do the visual design phase. And so again, like if we had to draw it out, this might be how the design process would look. But in all actuality, like when we're actually in the process of doing it, it looks something more like this. And that's because the subject matter that we're working with, people and humans, and sort of the way that they think and the reason that they do things, people are inherently complicated and kind of irrational. And that's kind of one of the great things about us. But people are nothing compared to trying to save the world. And so if you begin to combine a system that's trying to save the world and you're trying to drive that system with people, well, you've just created a recipe for like massive confusion and massive complication, on the Large Hadron Collider scale. And so as I'm looking at a system like this, I'm not necessarily, as a user experience designer, concerned so much with the technology, at least at first, as much as like the experience of the individual that is kind of within this system. And so when we're talking about systems, HunchWorks is a system that has the potential to affect the lives of 7 billion people. And of those 7 billion, as Chris mentioned, there are 5 billion mobile phones, and that continues to increase every year. And so HunchWorks has the potential to sort of bring in all this digital exhaust that, and data exhaust that people are producing sort of through their everyday interactions with these mobile devices and with other computing technology. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that people are more than just tailpipes, that people are using these devices and producing all sorts of information, but the best thing that we could do is actually try to get these people actively involved and actively contributing to the HunchWorks system. So what would happen if HunchWorks actually had 7 billion users, or even just a minuscule slice of those 7 billion users actually actively involved with and contributing to the system? And the challenge is we're not there yet. That it's pretty ambitious to try to design a system that big, but we do estimate that we could have a core user group that would sort of start using the initial version of HunchWorks as it rolls out into the world of maybe about 2,000 people. And so the question is, what do those people look like? And it could be people like Kisa that might be observing some sort of crop failures or something. Just observers that have a hunch about the world that something here isn't quite right, but they might not actually know what it is. It could be observers, people that are actually in the field that can actually take photographs or just collect evidence and post it on a system like HunchWorks. It could be reporters and journalists. Also, especially important, is data scientists and people who can actually generate this data, kind of combine this data, sort of try to help us find meaning in all of these weak signals that the system is identifying. And then finally, one of the most important things is people who can take action and people can actually respond to these emerging crises after they've been identified. And so all these different disparate groups would come together with the HunchWorks system and sort of collaborate. And so the question is, how are they going to do that? But really, the question is not necessarily how, but why are they going to do that? Because this is a human problem, and we're going to address it with a human solution. And so tools alone aren't necessarily going to be enough to make HunchWorks a successful product. That we can provide sort of the best data tools and sort of the best interactions we want, but if people don't feel motivated and don't feel compelled to use it, a product like this and a system like HunchWorks isn't going to be successful. And so what we need to do is actually build a strong community, build in that human connection in a system so it can actually sustain itself. And so we can do that, for one, by leveraging people's existing connections and also by actually using the HunchWorks system and the data that it has to suggest new ones. And so as people are going through the sign-up process, one thing that is going to be important is that we try to streamline this as much as possible by allowing people to, say, import their LinkedIn profile. If anybody's created a Google Plus account, we all know the experience of how not very fun it is to sort of add back all of your friends again. And so if you start with your LinkedIn profile or something, the HunchWorks system can then sort of make suggestions of, hey, these are other people that have signed up for HunchWorks that you already know within LinkedIn. But additionally, maybe the most important thing is that HunchWorks can make suggestions that you connect with people who have skills that are complementary to you, rather than just people that are sort of like you or people you may already know. Because again, we're trying to combine globally these different groups of people with different skills so they can collaborate on these issues. And so connections are something that's going to ultimately depend on trust. If people can't trust the HunchWorks system, and if people can't trust people using the HunchWorks system, this HunchWorks is not going to end up being successful. And so trust is something that's actually, it's really kind of weird and squishy, but it's established one-to-one, and it's established on a very personal level. And so we believe it's going to be important for HunchWorks to have people who are identified as community leaders, who are really going to work hard to set that tone and set that expectation of how interactions and how you socialize and sort of how you discuss things and evolve hunches within the system. And so I've talked a lot about the need to trust the user, but obviously as equally important is the ability to be able to trust the data and trust what people are generating. Because at the intersection of these two, between being able to trust the user and trust the data, you can begin to trust the hunch. And if you can trust the hunch, you can take action on it and you can actually create change out in the world. And so as we're looking at the HunchWorks system, kind of one of the most important parts of it is going to be when you're creating a new hunch, the ability to sort of choose people and connect people and actually have the system actively parse the metadata of the hunch to tell you who should actually be connected to it, who might have knowledge to be able to help with this particular hunch and contribute evidence to it and advance it forward. And so that's the important thing about HunchWorks and about hunches, is because a hunch is the discussion that surrounds it. A hunch isn't just a black and white thing and something that either that necessarily even is true or is not true. A hunch ends up being kind of a much richer, a much more nuanced thing. We want to make sure that all of that nuance is sort of teased out and discussed and sort of potentially even argued about out in the open, so we can actually sort of track back and sort of follow these pieces of evidence as they kind of continue to evolve. And so if we were to look at sort of like the summary of a hunch, one of the most important parts of this is going to be sort of the recent activity, pieces of evidence that's been associated with this hunch, whether the evidence is credible or not. So as evidence gets associated with it, and as people kind of comment on and refute or evolve those pieces of evidence, that all bubbles up into sort of the hunch's confidence score. And so the important thing here is not necessarily that we're trying to establish like absolute or objective truth, because HunchWorks is an action engine. It's not necessarily a truth engine. What we are trying to determine is whether or not a hunch is true enough to do something about it. And the best way to figure out if something's true enough to do something about it is to actually build this system and get people to start working with it. And so Sara is now going to talk about how we can actually make that action happen and sort of the technology that's going to go into the HunchWorks system to actually make this all work.
I'm responsible for technology at Global Pulse, and that brings its own special issues. So one thing that we are passionate about is making systems available that help the world, as you've just seen. And one thing that we have learnt about is that we can't do that without cooperation from both within and outside the UN. So our job is to make sure the analysts and the field staff get the tools that they need. And A, that's a lot of system that's needed. And B, that's something that other organizations across the whole humanitarian development and the open data spaces need too. So we're talking to those other organizations about what's needed and how we can best pool our resources to build the things that we all need. That's one of our code jams, by the way. And the easiest way for us to do that is to release all of our work as open source. We're making a commitment to that. We're open source as much as we can. And also, importantly, to act as facilitators and connectors rather than as big system customers. So we facilitate, we connect communities. We work with. Thank you. So, issues on the open source. It's not a new idea in the UN. UNDP and UNICEF and other parts have already trailblazed for us on this. We've learnt from them. We're grateful to have learnt from their experience on code jams, hackathons, Git repositories, and communities. And it's a community of people like Adaptive Path and like the open source coders you just saw who are making HunchWorks happen. I'd like to publicly thank them and thank their dedication and the dedication of our tech team. These guys do a lot with a little. We have a lot more work to do. Not least in building an open innovations culture across the UN. We've codenamed this Blue Hacks. And things like selecting the licensing models that allow us to share data and code whilst meeting the UN's core mandate. But in this project, in this pilot project, this is working well. So, we're already building out the human parts of the system, the trust, the groups, etc., that Dane's just talked about. But we don't work in isolation, and HunchWorks doesn't work in isolation. We need to integrate it into a wider ecosystem of both existing and new processes, users, and technologies. This is not just about technology, just underline that again. So we're seeing that the humanitarian technology world is changing very rapidly, and we spend a lot of time thinking about what it's likely to look like both soon and in the very near future and how we fit into that. So for HunchWorks to succeed, we need to connect to 4 other system types. So we need users, and we need to build our user population quickly. So we're talking about the lab managers, the development specialists, the mappers, the policy coordinators, the local media, the analysts that we want to use the system. So they'll also need specialist help from other users in areas like maps, crowdsourcing, data science, tools curation. So we need a lot of people connected. We have some carriers for that. The UN has a system called TeamWorks, so they already have a content management system, and that's being built by a team in New York. They're connecting up UN people, groups of UN people, and people from outside the UN, so we want to carry on that. LinkedIn we've already mentioned, so we're looking at other professional networking systems because the UN has people on them. And if we've already got groups out there, we should use them. Some of our users will be bots. We'll talk about that in a second. Other things we're going to need access to data. Or if we're talking about data philanthropy, as Robert spoke about the other day, we're going to need access to search results from data. So we're looking at connectors to, again, internal UN and external systems. So we're looking at things like UN SDI. So there's a project that's creating standards and gazetteers for geospatial data across the UN. We have a lot of gazetteers. We need to combine those. We're looking at CCAN. So we're looking at data repositories. And so we're looking at nodes that, again, we can share forces with an existing group like the OKFN on. And we're looking at things like GeoNode, JEarth, and a lot of other systems that are geospatial. It's not just open source, we're also looking at connectors into proprietary, but that's where we're starting. We'll also need tools. A lot of this conference has been about those tools. So we need tools to help the users make sense of the data. And we also want some of that done automatically, hence the bots. So we need toolboxes. It's not enough just to put a bunch of tools out there. We need ways to search through the tools in the same way that we already search through data sources. So we're talking to people like Civic Commons. We're talking to other groups about the best ways we can do that. We're building apps and plugins where we have to, but we want to put nodes around the world. We want to make it easy to put nodes around the world. So we're hunting down as much open source and openly available tools as we can find. We've got an initial list, but we're waiting for our first research projects to come through and finish before we finalise that, so we get a better idea of what people actually need rather than a great big list of things that we think they might just possibly. But at least on that list, we need data preparation, we need pattern recognition, text analysis, signal processing, graph processing, statistics, modelling, visualisation, the usual toolbag. Because we're putting HunchWorks in places in the back of Beyond, we're also committing to put in tools that could be useful in a disaster. So we're looking at things like Ushahidi, Sahana, OpenStreetMap, Google Tools, things that are already being used by groups to manage disasters. And there's a bunch of commercial tools and systems that we're going to need to interface with too. So we're talking to people already, people like Hunch. Similar names, kind of a hint. A bunch of other suppliers, but we're holding off on that till we get our first builds out. We need to get our code sprints out of the way before we can really start talking those interfaces. So please don't mob us. Tell us, but don't mob us. And our users also need a next. Back to Dane's point about being an action engine. We need a way to spur that action. So it's not just knowledge, we need to do something with it. So we're adding tools for that. There are, again, UN systems for project mapping. So we're talking to things like CRMAT, which is a system built in Sudan, which is a combined risk mapping and project coordination for development. So you're developing regions. We're also looking at tools which are still in the pipeline, like SIMS, which is coordination during humanitarian crises. So there is an idea called 3W, which is who, what, where, who's doing what, where. And we need to connect into that too. No point having the system if you can't do something with it. So it's a pretty big vision. And we're releasing first in next spring, but there's a lot to do after that. So it's another reason we're going to need all that partnering and facilitation. There's a lot of it. So I've talked a bit about the environment. So now just looking at the algorithms in there. So you've seen the designs for how we'd like users to work on hunches, but it's more than just a social system. And you need a lot of algorithms to make that difference. So we have to design and implement algorithms to make HunchWorks smart enough to show its users the information that's relevant to them when they need it. This is also known as looking for all the boxes marked, and then a miracle happens in the design. So the first needs we have are similarity and complementarity metrics. So there's a lot of work out there on things that are similar. A lot of systems, existing systems, are about similarity. What's more interesting is about how you can detect when people and their skills complement each other. So we've been looking at things like team theories from robotics. We've been looking at autonomy. We've been looking at using simple human-generated team templates as baselines to start that. You need relevance, so that you could paraphrase as we need some interesting search algorithms. Again, what we're looking for isn't quite what people are usually looking for, so we're looking at search, but we're also looking at adapting user profiling, looking at focus of attention, and including on that, not just focus directly onto the hunch immediately of interest, but also how you direct peripheral attention onto things that are related. So how do you keep that side vision going? We're looking at credibility. So we're looking at combining information about hunches and evidence and user support, and we're talking here about belief and estimates of belief for each hunch. So we're looking at using those as ratings. We're looking at rating hunches, people, evidence sources. There's work in uncertain reasoning, knowledge fusion, gamification. We could be helpful to us, and there are some excellent examples out there already. So a lot of what we're looking at exists already. We're also looking at how to map HunchWorks onto a reasoning system with hunches as propositions. So back to everything old is new again. We're just spotting the 1980s coming around again. Knowledge-based systems, we're back. Hunch splitting, merging, clustering. So we need to know when hunches are similar enough to suggest merging or clustering them. But we also need to highlight, because we're allowing users to edit hunch descriptions, when those descriptions diverge enough from the originals, and when the evidence with them diverges enough that we need to split them out. So again, suggestions. But luckily, a lot of the things that we need in algorithms are things that the research projects that we actually need in our toolbox anyway. So this is one example where we already have the algorithms for this, because this was built for the research. So we're looking at adapting that. And the biggie was the mixing human insight and big data results. So one of the things that makes this more than a social system is how we want to handle big data feeds. So it's not enough to give people RSS feeds and not enough to give them access to tools. And our environment, time is the most valuable commodity we have. So how do we best combine human knowledge and insight with automated searches and analysis? So back to the mission. Detect crises as they unfold in real time, alert people to investigate them further, take action to mitigate their effects. It's smart of us to use big data tools to detect data exhaust. It's smart for us to add human expertise, but it's a lot smarter for us to combine those two together. So we've argued a lot about this, but they all seem to boil down to one question. And the question is, do we treat big data tools as evidence or users? We treat them as evidence is easy. We talked a lot. And the more that we talked, the more we talked about how we did this, the more the bots started to sound like users. So we're using bots, agents, intelligent agents, whatever you want to call them. I think that's my 0-minute call. So they get the ability to be rated and the ability to be useful and useful members of the teams. So I shall skip quickly ahead. So things we need. We need security. So these are things that are difficult. We've got to deal with what happens when trust is broken. We've got to trace through sock puppet attacks. We've got to detect those. We have some ways of doing that. Localization. We have 6 official languages, but we're using labs all around the world, so we're talking hundreds of languages. That's going to take us a while. We can't lose people because we can't listen to what they needed. So we need to add that right from the start. And we also need to deal with federation. So we're starting off with a single instance, but we do have to deal with intermittent bandwidth. We also have to deal with completely broken bandwidth, which is part of putting in the data toolkit. We also need to work out ways to embed appliances off-site so we don't actually see the data. It's part of the data philanthropy again. But again, there are solutions, there are patterns. We're looking at systems like Git, we're looking at things like crisis mapper communities and other organizations with similar problems. So we're learning a lot from those about how people handle information across cultures and damage connections whilst under time and resource stress. And back to Chris.
I'm very conscious that we're running short on time, and I apologize for that. Thanks, Sarah. I'm sorry to hustle you along like that. So I just want to wrap. I just want to give a sense of the timeline that we're working with. We're building a prototype right now. We're hoping to have that ready in November. From November through January, we're going to be looking at our first release, and we're also looking to attract angel-style funding through the United Nations Foundation. And then we're hoping for our full featured release sometime in 2012 to 2013. We need your help. This is a non-trivial problem, as I hope we've established today. We are looking for support through funding. Through the United Nations Foundation, we're looking for beta testing communities, so we're very interested in researchers, in people who are interested in risk analysis, or for journalist communities, academic communities, NGOs who think this might be applicable to your work. We're looking to do a closed beta very shortly. We're looking for development partners, so we could use some engineering capacity to help us develop this out. And yeah, did I mention funding? We need funding. So I'd like to thank my co-presenters, Sara Farmer and Dane Petersen. We hope to do questions today, but we've obviously run over time. So thanks very much.